a lot of the pundits in the national media have sort of pitched the Democratic side as a two-horse race. Why is it that you feel you can win this election, and why do you want to be president?
Typically in our presidential contest, and I'm speaking as a Democrat, typically there's always an inevitable front runner, and typically the media is able to focus only on two candidates at a time. But also, it has always been the case. I can't remember a time when the results on caucus night and the New Hampshire primaries looked anything like the polls in November and December. So the beautiful thing about your state and the caucus process in Iowa is that for all of our justified concerns about big money determining the outcomes of our elections, the individual voters matter. And people are looking for a new leader. The two phrases I hear throughout the country are the phrases new leadership and getting things done. And people are now, just as the Christmas holidays are upon us, I believe that once we get these holidays behind us, that decision-making window is going to open. I already sense that as people come up to me on the streets and say things like, when is the date of the New Hampshire primary, or when is the date of the Iowa caucuses, in ways they did not before. So while a lot of us, because of your weighty responsibility as journalists or mine in making the offering, we think about this day in and day out, most people don't. But people are very concerned about their country. We know that we cannot give our children a better future if we make our country weaker. And we're also very aware that for the first time this side of World War II, we're all working harder, but nobody's really getting ahead. So if we're this dissatisfied with our gridlock, self-defeating national politics, and we are deeply concerned about what an economy where wages are stagnating or declining for a majority of us means for our children's prospects, we cannot then conclude that the way forward is either with a resort to more of the partisan, divisive politics of our recent past, or, on the other hand, turning to socialism to fix what's wrong with American capitalism. So that's why I believe that we are going to be surprising a lot of people in Iowa and also in New Hampshire. And I also find that you can tell where a country's headed by talking to our young people under 30. And I rarely find among young Americans under 30 people who want to deny that climate change is real, or who want to bash immigrants or slam America's door in the face of Syrian refugee families fleeing genocide, or young people in America that want to deny rights to gay couples or their kids. So I'm going to continue to speak to where our country's going, to that goodness within, and to draw it forward. We have a terrific organization on the ground in Iowa, terrific organization on the ground here in New Hampshire, and more friends taking off 30 days from work to come for this last month to help us here. And so I'm excited about these next days. I think this race is going to change pretty dramatically come the caucuses and election night. And what I have to offer uniquely is 15 years of experience as a mayor and a governor, bringing people together across some pretty deep divides, whether it's crime and justice and race in the city of Baltimore, or whether it's bringing people together to pass comprehensive gun safety legislation in Maryland. I'm the only candidate that's had to balance a budget all 15 of those years, and defended a AAA bond rating all the way through the recession, and a faster rate of job creation than our neighbors in Virginia or Pennsylvania, and the highest median income in the country during those times, second highest median income for African American families. In other words, I have practiced through actions, not just words, the politics and the economics of greater inclusion of all. That's the common thread, whether it was marriage equality or the DREAM Act, or making it easier for people to vote, or restoring voting rights, or reducing our incarceration rate to a 20-year low. It's all about inclusion, right? And it's a very stark contrast to the exclusive sort of rhetoric you're hearing from most of the candidates seeking the Republican Party's nomination. And so that's, I don't want to filibuster on the opening here, but that's in a nutshell an answer to both your viability and what do you have to offer that the other two do not. I mean, I would never have stated as Secretary Clinton did in the first debate when asked who are you proudest to have as an enemy. I would not have ever given the answer that all Republicans. If I walked into the governor's office like that, there are many things we wouldn't have accomplished. I mean, we only accomplished marriage equality and repealed the death penalty with some Republican votes. So I'm not a divider. I bring people together and I get things done. I've learned how to do it very well, and that's what our country needs right now.
So you've already raised, real quickly, the refugee issue. I wonder maybe if you could share your thoughts a little more fully as to why you feel the way you do relative to that, but also talk a little bit about how this country deals with the illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants who are already here.
Sure. The two separate issues, but like most issues, also connected. Also connected in many ways. Let me talk about the immigration issue first, if I may. This is the first time this side of World War II that we've seen wages actually stagnate or decline for 70% of us. That's never happened before. And I believe that there are certain actions that we took pretty consistently over a 30, 40-year period of time from the Second World War forward until about the 80s that allowed us to create an economy where wherever you started you could get ahead. Some of those common sense wage and labor policies include always keeping the minimum wage above the poverty line, making it easier rather than harder for people to join labor unions and bargain collectively for better wages, paying overtime pay for overtime work. But one of those actions we took was to have a sensible immigration policy, where instead of creating an off-the-books economy, you had people in the full light of an American economy. So I believe that one of the things, and this is backed up by Congressional Budget Office report as well, one of the things that will help us get wages going up rather than down is to get 11 million of our neighbors out of the underground, off-the-books shadow economy by passing comprehensive immigration reform. Our ability to reach a consensus on this has been going on for some time. I think since Ronald Reagan, at the very least. And study after study shows that new American immigrants are more likely to start businesses, more likely to take that entrepreneurial step that's so important to making our economy grow. And so, as long as I have been in executive service, I have always very consciously used the term new American immigrants to frame this issue in our search for a more prosperous framework here. We passed driver's licenses for new American immigrants in our state. Even though I was beaten up for it politically, I kept moving ahead. And we also passed the DREAM Act, so that not yet naturalized kids in our state could still be able to go to college in state if they qualified. And then when our opponents tried to cynically defeat it at referendum, we defended it at referendum. The dignity of every child's potential. We're all in this together. The more our children learn, the more they will earn, the better our economy will do. So that's Tom Friedman talked about the 5 things that he identified. You know, the hot, flat, and crowded Tom Friedman. He's from Maryland. He talked about the 5 aspects that he believes are the pillars of American economic success. A stable and balanced rule of law, investments in infrastructure and research and development. He also talked about immigration reform that allows the best and the brightest to come here as one of those pillars as well. On the issue of refugees from Syria, whether refugees and children and women and their dads are fleeing from genocide caused by Hitler, or whether it's genocide caused by ISIL, we as a nation have, in our better days, always understood that our strongest principle and our greatest strength is our compassion, our generosity as a people. Our enduring symbol is the Statue of Liberty. It's not barbed wire fences, immigrant detention camps, or other sorts of centers. And so when we see these images of little boys' bodies washing up lifeless on beaches in Greece, when we see moms and dads fleeing for dear life, this sort of genocidal evil that has now risen up in the vacuum to create this safe haven for terror that is ISIL, we have to respond And there are other ways to respond. We'll be glad to talk about the military response and coalition response. But one very important response is the humanitarian response. The thing that gives us our credibility in the world and in diplomacy and being a moral leader of other nations is when we act according to those principles here at home. And we should do the background checks and the security checks. I led the efforts for the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National Governors Association year in and year out on homeland security and preparedness. So yes, we should do all of those background checks. I've met with Syrian refugees' families. It's excruciating. It is an 18 to 24 month period. They go through all sorts of steps. But for us to surrender our American values in the face of this threat at the outset by not playing our role in protecting those who are fleeing genocide undermines everything that we're attempting to do internationally. And further, it plays into the narrative propaganda that ISIL is putting out, that we are at war with people of the Muslim faith. And so that's why I feel very strongly about the refugee crisis as well. And in my own state, when the kids were coming here from the failures of nation states in Central America under the pressure of drug gangs and the narcotics traffickers, while other governors said we should round up the rascals, and while other presidential candidates said send them back right away, in my state, we accommodated 5,000 Central American refugee kids. I broke with my own president and said, we don't want to put them in concentration camps or detention camps or congregate living, I shouldn't say concentration camps, in congregate living centers. Nobody agrees that that's a good approach for kids. So we brought together faith leaders and we took care of them in foster care and didn't miss a beat.
What does it say to you, to your view, about the fragility of the American psyche when you can have one shooting event out in California and it turns this whole immigration issue from building a wall to keeping everybody out? I mean,
would that such a breakthrough and realization happened on banning combat assault weapon sales in the United States. Maybe it is. Yeah. Maybe it'll create a little bit of a breakthrough there as well. When democracies are attacked, we become very vulnerable to being turned upon ourselves by unscrupulous politicians who harness our fears and pit us against one another, who scapegoat others. And that's a, so as I conceptualize, I was just speaking to a group of young kids at, where were we, Concord High School. And I said, as I see this fight, it's happening simultaneously on three planes. One is in the theater that vacuum that's been created in Syria and Iraq. The other plane now is in Homeland Security and better intelligence sharing, identifying of these potential cells or lone wolves, and and the dismantling of the network globally, which is more like attacking kind of a global narcotics syndicate. But the third plane is really happens and is played out in the choices we make as a free and thinking people in this democracy of ours. We all have a responsibility as citizens to push back against this scapegoating language, these sorts of appeals from Donald Trump that history tells us precede the path to fascism. And that's not an overstatement to say it. I never thought in the course of this presidential campaign I'd feel a responsibility to call it out and to say what it is. But that is what it is. When a candidate for president finds that his poll numbers are fed and fueled by saying that we should be issuing ID cards for Americans based on their faith, we should be cutting off travel to people based on their faith, that's a very dangerous path. And so I think what it says, back to your original question, is that we're human beings. And like all human beings and in democracies, when we're attacked in our homeland, we become susceptible to turning upon ourselves, and whether it's scapegoating others or surrendering the very freedoms and values that make us Americans.
Just circle back a little bit on the immigration point. So as a practical matter, you're president and you want a path to citizenship, but you're facing a legislature that's not going to be quite as friendly towards that idea. What kind of compromises can you see that would get you there? Are you putting up a wall in connection with that? Is that, I mean, how do you get there as a practical
Yeah, no
matter?
walls, no walls. When I have dealt with the legislature, in my own experience, I've found you have to call everybody, and you have to realize that while the issues are oftentimes separate and distinct, the search for better relationships and deeper understanding is an ongoing process. So you can't ever give up. The combination on one vote might be different on another. On one issue is certainly different than another issue, but the combination on the same issue over time also becomes different. So I intend to use the full extent of the President's executive authority to cover as many people as I can, as the President has under DACA and DAPA. I know it's being challenged in the courts. I believe it will be upheld, and I believe we need to go even further. We have right now in place, sometimes in government, there's two speeds, on and off. And somebody switched to the on position, a mindless deportation policy that in practical matters plays out as breaking up families. And we don't make our country stronger by breaking up families. So I intend to use the full extent of my executive authority to get this done. I also intend to bring in the course of this campaign greater attention to the sad truth that the United States of America, we the people, now maintain the largest and an expanding network of immigrant detention camps of any country in the world. There's a better way to go here. And I believe I've put out a plan for comprehensive immigration reform. I believe that's the best path forward. In the meantime, I intend to do as much as I can to build a consensus for that with executive action. And I intend to never give up. I intend to keep calling the question and bringing people back to the table every single year. I intend to organize on it as party leader as well as we head to redistricting in 2000. And I believe it's consistent with where our country's headed in terms of the attitudes of our young people, but with skilled leadership that's willing to go out there ahead of consensus rather than waiting until the consensus is formed. I think that can arrive the day of this sort of consensus on immigration reform.
Can we talk a little bit about the military response side of this issue in that part of the country, which is causing the displacement of these refugees? Lindsey Graham, who was here and who dropped out of the race today,
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, said that any candidate who didn't understand that dealing with ISIS means putting American combat troops on the ground in Syria and Iraq isn't fit to be commander-in-chief. I suspect you don't agree with that, but could you explain why that's not the case for you?
Yeah, well, I think it all depends on the definition of combat troops, which has become more nuanced and changed a bit here. So I've supported the president in putting more special ops advisors on the ground, and I could support in coalition a larger role for even more special ops forces and close air support. I think one of the lessons that we need to learn from these last few years is that sending in a whole division of Marines for a long, dug-in, occupational sort of mission has the opposite effect that we might intend for it. That, in other words, if a large American military presence allows the recruiters for ISIL to bring in more new recruits to replace the battlefield casualties that drones and special ops and the other coalition forces take off, then we're not making much headway. So I believe that what we need to do is double the battle tempo here in terms of diplomacy and pulling together that coalition. I think we have an opportunity to do it. ISIL has demonstrated a pretty far-reaching capacity, bringing down the airliner, the strikes in Paris, the at least inspired strikes here in San Bernardino, even if not ordered or coordinated, certainly inspired by. And they do that from a safe haven of operation that we've now allowed to grow up on our global commons. Once it was Afghanistan and we took it out, made the mistake of going into Iraq and set forward other cascading effects that combined with the collapse of Syria led to this safe haven here. So we need to. I also think that our role in the world, as we look at a new foreign policy and a new national security strategy, we need to develop regional alliances that can keep safe from these safe havens in our global commons, and that can forge regional forces. You see the seeds of this happening in Africa with the African Union mission in Somalia that's pushing back on al-Shabaab. Hopefully, if the Saudis are serious, if they put actions out to back up their words, perhaps maybe we're seeing the beginnings of this finally with not so much proxy wars between Sunni and Shia, but an actual peacemaking force with a broad coalition of nations in the Middle East. All of the military people I speak with and that I read agree that simply pursuing this path with only air power will take a very, very long time, and that some ground forces will be needed, first and foremost in Iraq, to reclaim their territory, but also ultimately in Syria. And that's the challenge of our times, is to double the tempo on that diplomatic effort rather than reaching once again for the big military tool and putting more American troops on the ground.
How concerning is it to you when you talk about reaching for that big military tool that the idea of carpet bombing and all-out war comes without any articulation of an exit plan for these candidates? I mean, does that worry you?
Yeah, there's no exit plan, and this is also, and it seems to be a failure to learn from the last times we've gone in with huge military presence. The nature of warfare and conflict has changed. It's no longer armies squaring off in a battlefield. There won't be a signing ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri when we defeat this iteration of ISIL any more than there was a signing ceremony after we got bin Laden. There's not white flags that are going to go up. So this is the nature of conflict. It happens in the gray zones underneath nation states, which means that we need a new national security strategy that's much more adept at identifying threats and the conditions that give rise to threats and acting on them in alliance ahead of time. I think there needs to be a clearly defined military mission here, and I do believe that it's essential for its success that it be done in broad coalition with other Arab nations and nations of the Middle East.
I have one more question that's a piece of this, and it's part of the national security plan perhaps, but on the heels of what happened in Paris, the government in that country has just passed some sweeping and extensive surveillance legislation so that they can really monitor people online and offline in ways that they never did before, way beyond that. What's the right balance for this country when it comes to privacy issues and surveillance?
Yeah, I believe that some ongoing American principles of privacy about requiring our government to get a warrant when they want to violate, whether it's the sanctity of the post or tap a phone or electronic communications, is still a constitutional principle, and one that we should not surrender in the face of this security threat. And I also believe that as new means and technologies and methods of communication arise, I think we need to work collaboratively with the telecommunications industry and with technologists to develop the means and the ways for governments, when they get a warrant, to be able to break through the encryption when our national security is threatened. I subscribe to Ben Franklin's admonition that we should never give up our privacy or our rights in exchange for a promise of security. And I think that's the challenge of our times. We need to make sure we maintain both.
The Obama administration has tended to pivot a bit in the direction of the Far East in their military planning, and I'm wondering if you think that's an appropriate balancing of strategic assets, or the recent developments in the Mideast are such that you think we ought, and maybe the Ukraine as well, that you think we ought to be looking in the more traditional areas.
Yeah, I believe that as a global power and as a leader among nations, that we need to be engaged all around the world. I don't. I read one astute observer who said that ballerinas pivot, great nations do not. We have a habit as a country of kind of always looking at the world in an east to west sort of way because of, I guess, our predominantly European roots and perspective. But that has historically led to our ignoring relationships in our own hemisphere. So I believe in a foreign policy that's engaged all around the globe, and balance is always important. Adjusting to the changing nature of threats, the changing nature of conflict, hotspots, but we have to be more engaged all around the world. It's not just a matter of saying this is where the enemy's coming from for the next 10 years. I mean, there's things we need to do. There's some great collaborations that could be of a life-giving and planet-saving nature that we could be engaged with the Chinese, but we also have to forge alliances in the South China Sea in order to mitigate the threats there and prevent the sort of territorial grabs that are also a very real part of security in the 21st century. So I don't think it's so much a matter of pivoting east or west. I think it's a matter of being more intelligent and intentionally engaged all around the world on more causes than simply military. And I'm so proud of our country's role in these recent Paris talks. There were many disappointments and frustrations I had about the last debate. I'm glad we had one though. And I got closer to equal time than I'd ever received in the prior ones. But I thought it was so sad that just days after that historic announcement in Paris on climate change, that it didn't even come up as a topic. We spent 15 minutes talking about Bernie hacking Hillary's database, and we spent no time on climate change. So I think those are the ways that we're engaged with the world.
Equal opportunity, because I don't think the Republicans addressed it either in their debates.
That's true. I brought it up in closing. I think I was the only candidate to talk about cities and immigration and climate change, and most of it I got to in the closing.
So going forward too, you're going to have to work with both parties, but you come from a primarily Democratic-led state. How are you going to be able to work across both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, Maryland is often called America in miniature. And some of the things that, in fact, before I was governor, we had a Republican governor, and we have a Republican governor now. George H.W. Bush actually won Maryland against Michael Dukakis. So our Democratic Party is a pretty diverse party. We have not only large numbers of African American families in our state, but we also have a lot of rural Democrats who have a hard time sometimes with many of the issues that we have had to get done. So let me try to reframe your question a little. Well, let me answer your question directly. First of all, I searched for ways constantly to bring us together as one Maryland. In fact, that was a thematic of all 8 years of mine in office as governor, that we are one Maryland, that we are all part of one state, and our children will all inherit this state, and that we are one Maryland. We're all in this together. The great Marylander Frederick Douglass said that we are one, our cause is one, and we must help each other if we are to succeed. And that's the ethic that we aspired to. And we succeeded in accomplishing a lot of really important things. And each of them was difficult. None of them happened just because I'm a Democrat and Democrats controlled the two houses. And some of the things that we got done, we only got done on a margin of 1 or 2 votes. Some of them it took us 3 times to do. And some of them, as I mentioned before, I think marriage equality and repealing the death penalty, we only got done with some Republican votes. In my first year in office, Republican members of the legislature, several of them said to me, "We've been in the governor's mansion more with you in your first year than we were in 4 years with our own guy in the governor's mansion." So bipartisan pizza nights, the breakfasts, using that house as a convening force to bring people together, strengthening what de Tocqueville calls our soft ties. treating people like people. I never ever would declare, as Secretary Clinton did, that she's proudest to say that Republicans are her enemies. And having been a mayor by training first, mayors don't have a budget for ideology. So I don't subscribe to an ideology as such, whether it's socialism or any other ideology. I believe in doing the things that work, that produce a better result. And as a modern executive, I also understand that the place of situational advantage for a leader is not high atop some sort of pyramid of command and control where you have all the information months before the people, like the old ways, but in the center of the emerging truth, acknowledging where things get done not on the basis of because I said so, but on the basis of because you can see it works, like I can see it work, like our neighbors can see it work. So whether it was the tough things that we had to do to improve the health of the waters of the Chesapeake Bay, or to pass our own climate change bill, or to dial up our renewable energy portfolio, or the fiscal issues. I mean, gee, we had, for as long as I can remember, we always had this looming structural deficit off the bow of the good ship Maryland. And in fact, when I came in, we had a $1.7 billion structural deficit that was about to crash upon that bow. But I brought people together to do a lot of difficult things on cuts and on the revenue side. And as a result, though, we were able to increase education funding by 37%. And we made our public schools the best in America 5 years in a row. And we were the only state in the recession that went 4 years in a row without a penny's increase to college tuition. And after doing all of those difficult things, raising the sales tax by a penny, asking our highest earners to pay, highest earning 14% of families to pay more on their income tax, I was still able to make the argument in the election against the same opponent, and we were reelected by twice the margin. So all of that comes back to your question of how are we going to get things done here. Look, I don't have a magic button, and I don't have a way to pole vault over these very divided and polarized times. But if you look at the three of us running for my party's nomination, I'm the only one of the three of us that can point to a history and a track record of bringing people together over some pretty deep divides. You know, it's also true in Maryland that my city council was 100% Democratic. But there is no issue that divides us more as a people along racial lines than issues of crime and justice and drugs, drug treatment, drug addiction, drug violence. And I pulled us together and put us on a path for a much safer future, saved a lot of lives. And so of the three of us, I have our best chance at pulling us through this. And we've had divided times before. We've come through them before. I believe we're going to come through these divided times now. But a key ingredient to that is putting forward a new leader that'll bring us together, not a new leader that'll divide us. As people are scanning the horizon, they're looking for that new leader, and they're going to find that new leader in one party or the other. And I hope they find it in ours.
Good ship, Maryland. I like that. Can I borrow that?
Sail on.
I can work that into a
Sail on, ship of state.
Governor, there
Lincoln. I think, no, it was Whitman. Was it Whitman? Who wrote the sail on, ship of state? Contact this, I should know that.
We'll get it right.
I know Lincoln loved it.
So shifting gears, there are federal laws that allow energy companies to seize property through eminent domain to site oil and gas pipelines. Is that okay, or should property owners and communities have a say in what happens?
This is the Kinder Morgan question?
Yeah, good for you. Didn't have to bring it up. It is the Kinder Morgan question.
Yeah, these pipelines are always very, very difficult. And if one is to use eminent domain, it should be for a national purpose, I believe, or public purpose. So on a sort of bright line test, I think you have to ask yourself: is the pipeline being, does the pipeline serve a national purpose? The Keystone Pipeline, I was very much against. I believe that it was not in our nation's interest to pipe in dirty tar sand oil from Canada that actually works against our goal of moving to 100% clean electric energy future. I'm the only candidate in our party to put forward a plan to move us to 100% clean electric energy grid by 2050. I hope the other two might follow after the Paris Accords, because it seems that's the direction that the world is headed, and therefore we must lead it. So on the pipeline issues, I mean, is it being replaced because they're broken and because we need it for public safety? I mean, in order to better protect the public so these things don't blow up? Well, in that case, that's a public purpose. Is it simply to make fossil fuel industry more profitable? Well, I don't know that that's necessarily a public purpose. So I'm not in favor of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and I believe that those that want to build it have to make a case as to why it is in the public's interest if they want to use eminent domain to take lands for that public purpose.
Another somewhat local issue is nuclear power. We have a plant that's in the process of decommissioning about a half hour's drive from this building. And in 5 years, there are going to be 58 dry cast concrete storage bins that are going to house about 4,000 spent nuclear fuel assemblies.
Right?
Does this nation need a plan, finally, to deal with storage of nuclear waste?
Yes.
What is it? How do we get there?
We didn't land a man on the moon with an all-of-the-above strategy, and we're not going to, solve this engineering challenge of 100% clean electric grid with an all-of-the-above strategy. I'm in favor of picking a winner in the next generation of safer nuclear power that will also eliminate the sort of growing nuclear waste sites that we have popping up behind the older style nuclear plants all over the country. We have one of our own in Maryland at the Cove Point site. And whether it's the molten salt technology or the pebble bed technology, we have to go to the next generation that's safer and that addresses this problem. From an engineering standpoint, it could well be possible that, at least where, as I understand it on the pebble bed technology, that those unused, the so-called waste from the older technology can actually be used up and used in the pebble bed technology, and all of that could happen on the same campus or the same site. It's a much more modular approach. So one of my favorite movies is Apollo 13. They say, we've got to work the problem, people. So we need to work this problem. A lot of these reactors are going to be coming offline. What's the percentage in your state that comes from that nuke? Do you know, of your energy mix?
Nothing, yeah, 'cause it's decommissioned.
It's already been decommissioned.
Yeah.
So you have the waste, but you don't have the energy from it.
Right.
Great, so you get the worst of both worlds. In our own state, about roughly 27% of our energy comes from Cove Point and those nuclear plants, which are reaching their useful end.
Well, it was interesting because the NRC had actually relicensed Vermont Yankee for another 40 years?
20 years.
20 years after the end of its originally intended useful life. And then the owners decided for economic reasons that they were going to shut it down. But the NRC was happy to see it go on for another 20 years. So is there a problem with federal policy on this?
Yeah, there is none. I mean, where it comes to the, it's been my experience that in the absence of goals, it's hard to make policies make sense. And we don't have a national goal yet to move to 100% clean electric grid with the action steps and the leading actions that then we would be able to see and say actually makes sense here. So that's what we need. Goals are important. Without vision, the people perish. And so I think we need a clearer direction here on the next generation of nuclear, which could also be safer and cleaner. And I do believe that we should pick a winner. I don't believe that these are things that simply the markets are going to come up with by themselves. And I think the capital costs need to be repaid over generations, not just in the slapdash of commodity prices in the here and now.
So to change topics once again, what do you think is the federal government's role in stemming the opioid crisis and the addiction crisis we're currently facing?
Yeah, I've sadly had a lot of experience when it comes to drugs, drug treatment, drug overdose deaths. My city had become, in 1999 when I ran for mayor, not only the most violent and most abandoned, but we had become the most addicted city in America. And yet in the 30-year run-up to that, we had not built a single inpatient drug treatment center. So in addition to improving how we policing, how we police the police, intervening in the lives of young people, the other promise I made that 1999 mayoral year was that we would invest a lot more in drug treatment. I made it our #1 priority in Annapolis for state help, and we dramatically increased the availability of drug treatment in our city and saved more lives, I do believe, in reduced overdose deaths than we did even in reducing the homicide rate in those years. And every year as governor, one of the 15 strategic goals I had for our state was to expand drug treatment. And we continued to save lives right up until the last 2 years when, of my service, when just like so many states in New England, we got clobbered by these highly addictive pain pills and the flipping of people from the pain pills to heroin, and heroin spiked with fentanyl. I've put forward a plan that would invest $12 billion over the next 10 years in supporting local public health initiatives that are focused on therapies that actually work, a continuum of care, not just the relatively easy task of not just the relatively easy task of the detox, but the 28-day beds, which are hard to create. The good news is with the Affordable Care Act, there's the ability to cover more people here, and it's not quite the burden that it was 15 years ago if a state or a city wanted to tackle this on its own, but it does require some federal response. I also think we need better guidelines from the FDA. I mean, my goodness. I mean, here's an agency that's accused of having a great case of the slows, and somehow, without anybody owning up to exactly how, they approve these highly addictive pain pills for long-term pain. We need to revisit that decision, and we need to put better guidelines in place right away to warn off doctors from these sorts of prescriptions. Many of us have gotten better at shutting down the pill mills and being able to use technology so that people can't go shopping for different doctors and filling up the scripts. But then it flips to the illicit drug trade and heroin. I do believe that we're getting a little better at tracing that stuff back to its source. But the real intervention that can save lives, we believe, after wrestling with this, and frankly, I wasn't able to get it to go back down even by the time my term expired. But we did come to figure out that the leading indicator of whether or not a person is in danger of being killed with a drug overdose is whether or not they've already shown up once to your emergency room with a near miss. But because of the shame associated with this, because of concerns of patient privacy, we have yet to develop the systemic interventions at the local public health level that can see that leading indicator and then swoop in there and save that person, get them right away into treatment, into a treatment bed. And you know, the drug courts are fine and they're nice and we enjoy debating them and it makes a room nod and everybody likes it, but drug courts really don't make much of a difference if you don't have some place to refer the person afterwards. It may make the judges feel good, but if you don't have a place to send the person right away when they're at that golden moment of intervention, when they present at the hospital, or even upon arrest, you're not going to get ahead of the problem. So those are all in my plan that I've posted online. I asked our own public health doc towards the end of my term, what would we be doing if the people showing up with a near miss on an overdose death in our hospitals were presenting with Ebola rather than with a drug overdose? And at first he started to say, well, the drug overdoses aren't contagious. I said, no, I know that. But there are far more people from a public health standpoint being killed by drug overdoses than there are being killed by Ebola. And yet we're not responding like we should. Your firefighters are presenting a plan. Your statewide firefighters here in New Hampshire are presenting a plan to, what do we call it, the Joint Committee? Do you guys have a joint committee or something that's looking at how you get ahead of this opioid
Commission, yeah.
commission?
Yeah.
So they have an interesting proposal which I think merits, they want to train all of their paramedics and firefighters statewide to intervene at that first response with the person. In Rhode Island, in Providence, there's a program where they literally have almost like a minute, almost have a, an on-call network of people who are themselves recovering addicts who will drive to the hospital when they get the call that someone's presented with a near miss. And almost like we found that veterans do a better job of talking credibly to other veterans. People who have an addiction often are more credible in talking to other people with an addiction. So these are the connective sort of things that we have to do much earlier in the process when that person shows up with the first overdose death. And some federal support there could go a long way for those of us in states that are highly motivated given the nature and the scope of the threat.
So that sort of first indicator thinking sounds like it's gaining some traction.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would the investment for the programs, would that just be at that stage, or would you work for some for like preventive and then others for like long-term recovery, or?
I think you have to do all of them.
Yeah.
Some of them are more expensive than others.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, the most expensive aspect of it is the startup of the 28-day centers. That's the most costly thing. Another piece of this are the recovery communities after those 28-day periods. That's a huge challenge for local governments to cite. People understand in concept the need for group homes, but they fight them tooth and nail unless they're associated with the church or somebody responsible in the neighborhood. So all of that requires, it's, I guess you have to think of it, one way you might think about it is like a pool.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, there's a shallow end to the pool and there's a deep end to the pool. And you have to, when people fall in the deep end with that near miss on an overdose,
Mm-hmm.
You gotta kind of walk them up to the shallow end. If you can cut them off at the shallow end, there's interventions that are cheaper that can get them out there. And one of the big ones is we need to rein in the overprescribing of these long-term pain pills for chronic pain.
Do you think too, I don't know if you would necessarily constitute it as a second wave, but do you think there's anything in this like second set that's different and that's raised any different issues that you feel need to be addressed that weren't necessarily present the first time around?
Well, with the opioid addiction compared to the other addictions that I was battling before, it's the pain pills. Mm-hmm. It's the prescription. It's the prescribing. Maybe some enterprising plaintiffs' attorneys will put together a huge class action against the industry for putting out these highly addictive pills. But the FDA made a big mistake in greenlighting these very highly addictive pills for the treatment of chronic pain, long-term chronic pain, and we need to reel that back in. That's one of the most important things you can do on the prevention side, is to greatly reduce the overprescribing of these things.
Switching to an easy topic, economic policy.
An easy topic.
So in your opening statements, you referenced economic stagnation and needing to address that. And last week we saw the Fed raise interest rates because we're in recovery, they say. Not all the way, but feeling much better about where we are economically as a nation. So is there a disconnect there, and what do you think needs to be done?
Yeah, this is how I think of it. I look at our economy as an ecosystem of supply and demand, of and investment, and that all of this is very much circular and circulatory. When, in other words, you have 70% of economic growth is fueled by consumer demand, and 70% of consumers are earning the same or less than they were before, it's understandable that in a low interest rate environment that money would gravitate to non-productive investments and superheat in the markets and go to a speculative yield. You won't solve that simply by raising interest rates. You'll solve that by adopting or restoring the common sense wage and labor policies that make wages go up again over time for all Americans. But it is related to the interest rate. So look, I'm not opposed to the Fed, the one kind of functional tool that we have when Congress can't agree on much of anything. I'm not opposed to them reeling back in that interest rate. I mean, it's been so far out there at a low rate that I do think over time that tapering has to happen in a moderate, predictable way. But the long-term goal of encouraging investment in the productive economy, the job-creating economy, that's going to be accomplished by several different levers. One is the common sense wage and labor policies. Another one are the investments that we can only make together in our own country, like in infrastructure, whether it's high-speed rail, and investments in the talents, the skills, the education level of our people to fill the new jobs being created in the new economy. And a third piece of it being this transformation to a clean, green energy future, which I believe is the greatest business opportunity to come to the United States in 100 years. All of these are the things that will get wages to go up, that will create more market demand. And I think there's a few things we need to stop doing as well. These mindless trade policies where we go in a blindfold backwards into these trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm opposed to that. I am also opposed to looking the other way at Wall Street. I'm in favor of reinstituting Glass-Steagall to protect the Main Street economy from this concentration of power among the big banks that still has all of us very vulnerable and on the hook for another bubble or another sort of crash. And so I think you have to do all of those things together. But I believe that a part of it is restoring more, shall we say, normalcy back to interest rates and reining in that low interest rate and doing it in a predictable way, that tapering.
And then sort of switching a little bit into tax policy matters, and I wonder, you talked about, I believe, increasing tax rates on the wealthier in the country. And how does that relate to, at the same time, your record is balancing budgets, and what does that additional revenue source do for you in that sense? And well, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, here, let me give you my short take on that. When I graduated we were investing twice as much as a nation when I graduated from high school in non-defense discretionary investments like transportation infrastructure, like research and development, and affordable college, because I consider that kind of intellectual infrastructure in this context, than we are today. And no great people ever cut their way to prosperity or gave their children greater opportunities in the next generation by making their own nation weaker. So we suffer at the federal level from a lack of revenues, and I believe the best way to make up that gap is to look at those areas that have benefited the most from a lower marginal rate for the super wealthy, and also the way we tax capital gains at a much lower rate. or as I said the other night in the debate, there's a big entitlement we can no longer afford as a nation if we're going to give our kids a future with more opportunity. And that is the entitlement that the super wealthy among us, those making more than $1 million, feel that they're entitled to in terms of paying a lower marginal rate historically than they ever have, paying a much lower rate on earnings that come from investments rather than earnings from hard work and sweat and toil. If we, for the most part, tax capital gains at the same rate as we do gains from hard work, and also raise the marginal rate on millionaires and above to 45%, that would generate $800 billion over the next 10 years on an annualized budget of $3.2 trillion. That could pay for a lot of important investments to give our kids that better future. Affordable college, the research, the clean energy future, as well as infrastructure and rebuilding of our city centers and attacking the structural unemployment problem that much of our nation still suffers from. So that's my take. How it squares with what I did as governor, I cut our budget by more than any governor in modern Maryland history. Probably any governor that served during this recession can say that piece. But what we also did was we put together the consensus to tackle that structural deficit that I talked about. Maryland, for the first time now, has a surplus this year because we not only made those cuts, but we also asked people to all pay another penny on their sales tax so that we can make the investments in education. Did we enjoy doing it? No, none of us enjoyed doing it. But we also understood that the dollars were going to our kids and our kids' schools. We asked the top 14%, the highest earning 14% of Marylanders, to pay a higher local income tax rate. And there were many who predicted at the time that every millionaire in our state would pack up their bags and go to south or north of the border. And that did not happen either. I mean, we had the highest number of millionaires per capita when I left office. Even with those adjustments, because it's about quality of life. And also asked our corporations to pay another 1% on their corporate income tax, which we split between higher ed as a dedicated source of funding and transportation investments. So look, none of that was easy, and all of it was difficult. We also put in place a gaming regimen in our state, which we had not had before, allowed gaming at 5 sites in our state, and the vast majority of those dollars also went to support our education investments. But that was not the only solution. We had to do a bunch of different things. Had them in a big package. All of it nearly crashed and failed. Some of the pieces passed by only 2 votes, but we got it done.
And as you look at the federal deficit situation, are there spending priorities there that you think are misplaced that should be dialed back in order to sort of move in the direction of a balanced budget? Or
I think there's always economies and always efficiencies to be found. I received the Innovations in Government Award from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and the innovation that I brought forward to municipal government was called CityStat. The core of that innovation was we started measuring the outputs of government instead of just the inputs. And most of our way of managing government has been driven by the annual budget. What are the inputs? What are the inputs we need for next year? Rarely do we ask, what are the outputs? What are we measuring in terms of performance? Or are we wasting fewer dollars on overtime pay and unexcused absences this week than we were last week? So we started measuring the outputs of government on a 2-week basis across 14 different departments. And cities all over the United States of America have now adopted this new way of governing. We put 311 on the front end for city services, and then using geographic information system and performance management, we gather people in a collaborative circle every 2 weeks around the emerging truth, the common platform, and that allows us to see who the leaders are. And we saved a lot of money by reducing overtime and other sorts of things. But the biggest, what we suffer from at the federal level is a lack of revenues, because we were sold this theory that said that if you cut taxes, the trickle-down theory, if you reduce taxes, especially for the wealthiest people, in our country, they will reinvest those dollars in the productive economy and create more jobs and more opportunities for all of us. Well, that didn't happen. What happened instead was that we were no longer able to make the discretionary investments, which are now going to be roughly half of our GDP compared to what they were when I was in high school in the 1980s. And that in those things that I articulated before, affordable college, infrastructure, and those sorts of things. So I really do believe that while there's certainly savings to be had in the federal government, yes, we need more openness and transparency in the Defense Department budget. There should be ways to modernize our nuclear triad deterrence that also reduces warheads and reduce costs. But we're also facing the challenge of defending a whole new domain. Just when we figured out how to protect land, air, and water, there's the cyber domain that we have to protect against. And so that's going to require other investments in our armed forces and our capabilities. And so I don't want to filibuster here, but I do think that we have to face up to the fact that we're not investing enough in our own country's potential. We're not only shutting our government down, we're selling our nation short by putting in place these mindless sequester cuts that prevent us from doing the very actions that made us the land of opportunity, that allowed us to include more people in every generation more fully in the economic, social, and political life of our country. So,
And is entitlement reform part of the picture as well?
I've put forward, I don't subscribe to those who, well, let me say it affirmatively. I've put forward a plan to actually expand Social Security. I don't believe it needs to be reined in. I don't believe it needs to be cut. I don't believe that people should have to pay taxes into Social Security for another few years before they get the benefits of it. I put forward a plan to increase Social Security benefits by an average of $65 a month, and even more so for lower earning people. And I've put forward a plan to do that by scrapping the cap on incomes currently once they reach over $250,000. I do believe that reforms are required to rein in the huge amount of money that we spend in health care, much of which is in Medicare and in Medicaid, but throughout the health care system. And one of the great frustrations of the last two debates is that I was not allowed to answer the question the other two fine candidates were able to answer on health care. Because in my state, we're actually doing something that works. And the New England Journal of Medicine just recently did an article about how Maryland, alone among the states, has moved all 46 of our acute care hospitals off of fee-for-service, where hospitals are made more profitable by how many fees they generate and also by how many sick bed nights they keep filled out. And instead, we now make global payments to those hospitals based on past performance and the big data that we have available to us from having an all-payer rate-paying system. And we set the goal of reducing avoidable hospital room readmissions by 10% over the next 2 years. And guess what? In the first year of moving to this, we cut them by 11.5%. We avoided $110 million in Medicare alone by giving the hospitals a piece of the action here in improving wellness. So as they reduce their avoidable hospital room admissions, as they keep people out of their hospitals with better connected and better coordinated care and improve their wellness, they're able to share in the savings when they reduce those avoidable hospital room admissions. And it's actually working. The institutional care at the center of our healthcare system is the biggest cost driver. And that's what we need to get a handle on. We need to, it's not unlike, actually come to think of it, the higher ed costs. You know, it's a sort of bridge over the River Kwai syndrome. It's not about the bridge, it's about the war effort. When higher ed's concerned, it's about degree completion. When it comes to healthcare, it should be about wellness, not about how many sick bed nights you're able to keep filled up in your hospital. There's a real good article written on this called in a Business Insider, an online publication, the title of which is "There's a Healthcare Revolution Happening in Maryland and Hardly Anybody's Talking About It." And in the last two debates, that was certainly true. Maybe the next time around.
Well,
maybe the third time's
having
in charge. Yeah.
Matt's given me the guess we're all done here.
Well, look, I would love to have your support in this election. I believe our country is looking for a new leader and a candidate that can bring us together, a president that can bring us together around the principles that unite us as a people. It's fine to be a voice for change. It's another thing to actually accomplish that change. I have a record of bringing people together around progressive goals, progressive values, and doing it with economic success for my people that makes wages go up and not down. So I would love to have your support. There's never been a time where the results come Iowa and New Hampshire look like the polls in December or November. You guys have a critically important role to play in this process, and I would very much appreciate your support.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, guys.